class for this evening. This is October. Did anybody notice? It's like October weather, right? Beautiful outside. So I'm glad you guys chose to come inside to join us for Squash from A to Z. I do have to admit to you guys, though, that we didn't go all the way to Z. We stopped at S. So we just really have squash from B, A, B, and S. Sorry. So maybe we'll have to save Z for later on. Zucchini. Oh, okay, but we don't have a recipe for it. So we'll talk about zucchini to some degree. So again, welcome. I'm Rhonda. I'm one of the dietitians here at the hospital, and you remember Jared. He spends his life in the kitchen down the hall. And then Austin is another dietitian here at the hospital, and Lynetta should be joining us shortly.
She's here!
Oh, she is here.
She's here.
Oh, yeah, good. Okay. So we also have another person that is working with us now. Jacob Klessens is a dietetic intern, so he's watching and doing one next month. So he'll be involved with us next month when we do cooking class. So again, thanks for coming. We are doing squash tonight. What do you think of when you think of the word squash? Zucchini squash? Acorn squash? Butternut? What about the game of squash? Anybody know what that is? I know.
It's English.
It's English. It's an English game, but that's not what you think of. We think of food. We think of something to eat. So it's one of those foods that's a really nutritious food for us in that vegetable category. Some of it's a little bit more, some of them are a little bit more starchy than others, but a really nutritious food. And so the other, we're going to be telling you about that a little bit later on, and then also, of course, doing some samples as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and let Austin talk to you about the first recipe. It's the pumpkin one.
Can everyone hear me all right? Does mic work? Okay, good. Awesome. Figured it out. All right, so how do you fix a pumpkin with a hole in it? Does anyone know? Well, you give it a pumpkin patch. There's your pumpkin joke for today. So the pumpkin is part of the squash family. Squash family comes in all shapes and sizes, as you can obviously see here. But the pumpkin was considered probably the most popular because you use it for food and recreation. So what are some of the recreational activities we use for pumpkin? Jack-o'-lantern. Yep. There's even contests to throw. Yep, pumpkin toss, the pumpkin chunkin', like they say. Even painting pumpkins. So it's really used for more than just food. And it's even considered a complex carbohydrate. It's very nutrient dense, which means it's got lots of vitamins and minerals in it. Vitamins such as vitamin A, which you guys may know that helps your immune system and keeps your skin glowing. Vitamin C, which is another antioxidant that helps your immune system. And then it has a high source of potassium, which can help regulate your blood pressure. So think of a pumpkin as, a good source of potassium. Instead of going to your banana, as everyone may know, that's a good source. A pumpkin can also help you get in some of that potassium. So does anybody know some ways that how you can tell if a pumpkin is ripe or not? Anyone know any tricks?
Heavy for the size.
Yeah, that's good. I think that goes with all squash, if they're heavy for their size. If you thump it and it's hollow, it's a good pumpkin. Whenever it's orange and the rind is hard, that's how you can tell it's a good pumpkin. And also if you stick your fingernail, if you press up against it and it doesn't impact the skin right away, that's a good pumpkin as well. So pumpkins are best stored in what kind of climate do you think? Cool. Yep, cool and dry. And a fun fact that I just learned today is that if you put a pumpkin on the concrete, it's more likely to rot. So they suggest you put pumpkins on wood or cardboard to help soak up some of that moisture. So try that out with your jack-o'-lanterns this year. I know they'll be outside, but it could help them last longer and look better. So try that out as an experiment. They also recommend, wiping off all that dirt and excess, type of random things you might get on your pumpkin that might cause them to mold or rot quicker throughout the year. So this recipe isn't necessarily a sweet recipe like you'd be used to, like a pumpkin pie. This is more savory. It's not really intense pumpkin flavor like you would find in like a pumpkin pie. Like I said, it's savory. And then whenever you're going out to get like a pumpkin mix, try to get a pumpkin mix that doesn't have a whole lot of added sugar. So a good way to tell that is just to look back on the nutrition facts, and it'll have total added sugars. And some of those recipe or the nutrition facts have a section under that says included sugars. You just want that number to be 0, and that'll just be healthier for you. Get rid of that processed sugar out of your diet. But yeah, you guys are getting it. So let me know how you think once you guys start tasting it out. You really want to, like the recipe calls for, to caramelize those onions. And a good caramelized onion is nice and brown. This recipe has butter, and I think that's the best way to caramelize an onion, in my opinion.
Yes, definitely. Sometimes if you're really bad about your heat in your skillets, if you'll melt your butter and add a little bit of oil to it, canola oil, olive oil, just use olive oil sparingly depending on the recipe that you're using. Some things just taste weird with olive oil, right? You don't want to do baking with olive oil, it's got a weird flavor to it, so don't do that. But if you'll add it, it'll help it from keeping it from scorching and burning that butter. So,
thank you. All right, my name is Lynetta, and I would like to share with you a little bit about the acorn squash. So looking at all these beautiful squash up here, which one's the acorn squash? Yeah. Jared kind of gave it away because he put it on the cutting board. All right, so a little bit about the acorn squash. It's vibrant in color. Not only does it come in green, but you can see it in other shades, including white. It has a lovely sweet yellow flesh that we're going to see here in a minute. And as you get your sample here in a while, you'll get a taste of it. How would you describe the acorn squash? The name kind of gives it away. It's got a nutty flavor. Yeah, it's got a nutty flavor. It's a little bit different flavor profile than some of our other squash. It's delicious. Not only does it have a nutty flavor, but it lends itself to a lot of different dishes. You can cook it savory like we're doing tonight. You can cook it sweet. And it's also packed with nutrients. And so botanically, if we're talking about, what kind of a squash it is, it's considered a fruit, but nutritionally speaking, it's considered a starchy vegetable. So when I say starchy vegetable, what do people usually think about? Potatoes, yeah. So this is an interesting squash that you can use kind of like a potato. And so if you have a favorite dish that you use potatoes in, this might be a good substitute for that. And so tonight, we're doing a stuffed squash. And so I'm not suggesting that you switch out your baked potatoes for stuffed squash, but it is something kind of similar. Acorn squash are pretty easy to grow. They're favored by gardeners. Is there anyone in the room that's a gardener? Couple hands. Has anyone ever tried growing acorn squash?
Yes, I have.
All right. It's a fun squash to grow as long as you can keep those squash beetles away and keep it away from mildew. I'm going to jump on a little bit of what Austin has shared. There's specific ways that you can store squash. And so you want to keep them in a dry, cool environment. You want to keep them clean, and so that grime on the outside of the squash, it's just like keeping your skin clean, right? You want to keep dirt and bacteria off to keep things from getting infected. Same is true for our produce. You want to keep them nice and clean. And keeping them in a cool place, so think of a cool place in your home that's not real humid. If you get the right storage conditions, these little guys can stay fresh for several months at a time. They make a great vegetable to purchase and to look at. I like to keep mine on my counter where it's away from sunlight, and it's pretty for a good couple of weeks. And so not only is it good nutritionally, but it's a good decoration. All right, talking about the nutritionals for squash, I said that it was a starchy vegetable. So when we talk about starch, we're talking about carbohydrate. And specifically, the carbohydrate that you find in our acorn squash is what we call a complex carb. That's a carb that won't raise your blood sugars very quickly. It takes longer for your bodies to digest. The acorn squash is really rich in fiber, that's in that carbohydrate group there. It's got 9 grams in 1 cup. And so 1 cup is about the size of your fist. That's a lot of fiber. It's also got a little bit of protein in it, which is unusual for our plant-based foods. Usually when we talk about protein, we're talking about animal foods, right? Meat, beans, eggs, dairy. But we actually have a little bit of protein inside this vegetable, which makes it kind of special. There's 2 grams in that 1 cup size. It packs a big nutritional punch. Not only does it have a lot of fiber and a little bit of protein, it has a lot of vitamins in it. So I'm going to go through this list here real quick, so put your listening ears on. It's got about 20% of the amount of vitamin A that you need in the day. So that's a lot of vitamin A that can help with your eyes. It can help act as an antioxidant in our bodies, which keeps our bodies healthy against chronic disease and cancer. It's got about 37% of the vitamin C that you need in a day. That helps with our immune system, kind of something I need this time of year, right? With the cold and the flu around, I want a lot of vitamin C to help me, and it's not just oranges that have it, it's also this beautiful squash. It's got 20% of the amount of vitamin B1, vitamin B6, magnesium, potassium, manganese. Say that 10 times fast. A lot of good nutrients inside that little guy. Last thing I want to share about this acorn squash is that I hope you really like it. It's very, very good to eat, and Jared's going to show us how to cut it.
Yes. It is definitely a difficult squash to handle. It's one that I will urge you to deal with caution. Your knife is going to want to slide away. I don't know if you've ever dealt with them before, but they're very, very thick-skinned, right? So what I recommend is take your spoon or the backside of your knife, and if you can hit that stem that's already off of this one, you can see it on this one, you can just, and it pops right off, right? I'll get this thing. I personally, I like to cut the very ends off as well, just very, very carefully, just chop that right off. Get that out of the way. That's one less. A lot of times the stems can be really hard too, especially if they've been dealt with and in storage for a while before you pick them up at the store. Those will get rock hard, and they're just another way for that knife to slide off and cut your hand straight in half. So, not really. If you're like me and you want them to be even halves, which if you're cooking them for this purpose whole, you're going to want to keep them as even as possible. So it's really important to make sure that whenever you place your knife down and start pressing to cut, that it's straight, right? And it's very, very easy to get them off. So you just want to slowly start working it down, right? And mine's already started kicking out. Oh yeah, always. They know that. Yeah. Never use a dull knife.
Don't
right?
use a dull knife, he says.
Never, ever, ever. So, and then as far as the seed pods, it's really easy. If you can look here, you can see where this almost comes to a point where you've got a little bit whiter of a flesh, right? So you've got a little bit whiter of a flesh there, and the same goes for here. So really, you're just gonna put that spoon right up here at the top. Press in nice and hard. Run it straight around. Keep working it until you get in. Scoop. Good to go. Depending on what you're making or how particular you are, you may want to go back at it again and just kind of try to scrape a little bit more of that out. I'll show you what I'm meaning here just a second. This one's got more of it. You can see where it's a little bit more orange in spots. That's more of where your seed pod meets the meat of the squash. If you're real particular, you can mess with that and clean it up to where it's perfectly clean, but I'm not telling that that's necessary. So they're good just like that. And then as far as stuffing them goes, once they're partially most of the way cooked, you'll just take your sausage stuffing that you had, and we'll pretend that this one here is cooked and ready to go, right?
It's delicious.
Yeah. Oh, it smells great. Almost completely cooked. So some of them are going to be deeper than others, and I'll tell you this, it's really difficult to find ones that are, I would say find ones that are bigger like this, if you're going to be stuffing, right? A lot of times the seed pods on these are a little bit smaller, so therefore you don't really have as much space to put your stuffing in. So, and then you're just gonna pack that dude in. You can cover it with cheese when it's done.
Okay, this recipe would go really well with Parmesan cheese, I think.
There it is.
And so a little bit about how I prepared it at home is I bought some acorn squash and used them as a decoration in my kitchen for a week or two while I built some courage to cut them. And I found an evening where I cut them and placed them in the oven to soften for 20 to 30 minutes. And that's all the time I had that day. And so I set that aside. I had that softened squash. And then the next day I decided I'd go ahead and stuff them. And so I had more day to prepare the stuffing mixture. And so to do that, you just caramelize onions, which Jared shared a little bit ago, that there's a secret ingredient, a little bit of butter, goes really well with caramelized onions. And you want to make sure that you stir them to prevent them from getting black and browning. What you're doing is you're letting those onions become real sweet. And so that caramelization, you're making the sugars come out. Once those onions are caramelized, you add garlic and sausage and brown it. And to this dish, we're adding apples, another great fall season fruit. You could omit that, but I think it really adds a delicious touch. And then you just stuff those squash just like Jared showed you and pop it in the oven to heat it up.
So our next recipe is the Cajun chicken spaghetti squash bake. So how many of you have used spaghetti squash? Lots of you. So I got to play with that as well because I tried it over the weekend. You know, spaghetti squash is, again, it's really nutritious like we've talked about some of the other squashes being. The spaghetti squash actually does have a little less of those complex carbohydrates in it. So for those of you that have been in my diabetic education classes, we don't really have to count it as a full choice because there's a few less carbs in it. So it's a good substitute a lot of times for spaghetti, of course. That's kind of, I think, where it got its name. So it also, you know, it has less carbs in it, but it's a good source of vitamin A. Has some of that in it. And then I was surprised that it's a pretty good source of vitamin B6. It's one of those vitamins that we don't really worry much about, but it does give us, you know, some of those B vitamins as well. And then it also had some magnesium in it as well. So it can have some of those nutrients in it, and it really helps when we eat a variety of things. So spaghetti squash is one of those. The spaghetti squash is a good vegetable, little bit more starchy than our green beans and our asparagus, but they can be ivory, yellow, and orange, or orange would have the highest amount of that carotene, that vitamin A precursor, so you kind of might want to look for that. I didn't find any orange ones when I was looking for spaghetti squash in the last few days. So when they're cooked, you know, and Jared's going to show us just in a minute, when they're cooked, they got the name because it looks like those spaghetti strands. So I think it's a good way to substitute for that spaghetti. A lower carb content, not completely zero, but a lower carb content, picking up a few more of those vitamins and minerals. So we paired this particular recipe, was paired with Cajun chicken. Who doesn't like Cajun chicken? Most all of you, it might be too spicy for you. So when I went to look for a Cajun seasoning, Misha advised me to get Slap Your Mama's seasoning. Anybody ever seen that one? Slap Your Mama Cajun seasoning. So that's what I tried at home. That's not what we have in this particular recipe because Jared had another brand he used out of the kitchen, but there is the regular one, and there's also a low sodium one that they make. I did not find the low sodium for the recipe I tried at home this weekend, but the low sodium version of this particular brand is similar to what Jared used in the recipe, Sawyer's, and it's actually a lower sodium Cajun seasoning. And so, you know, we would always encourage you to maybe look to that to try to reduce the sodium content in the recipe. So,
as far as cutting goes, same with the others. It's a little bit easier to cut, but it's longer. So to get that even halves, it can be a bit of a chore. I would recommend just going after it. Right?
a nice sharp knife.
Good sharp knife. Yep. And then as far as the seed pods go, you can almost see a perfect line all the way around where that seed pod is. Some squash are not that defined as the difference between the flesh and the actual edible portion. Those strands of, or spaghetti noodles, I guess you could call them, they go around, right? So the grain of them goes around like this. And that's important for whenever you go to shred it, because you don't want to go this way with it, because then you're going to be cutting your strands in half. If they're done right and the skin's nice and toasted brown like that, they'll flake around very easily. So go just find that division between the outer shell and the flesh. Get it all worked out. Right? And then you're just going to start getting it. I will tell you, as far as the ends go, they can be a bit finicky. So I just, whatever falls off and comes apart from that area is good by me. If you've done it right, you should have next to nothing left inside of the skin, and it should be ready to go. And as you can tell from this, you've got nice, dry noodles, right? Sometimes, this is just me, this is the way I've always baked them. I've tried them. If you look on YouTube, they'll tell you to bake them like this. I personally don't like baking them that way. I've not had luck with them baking even. I feel like this portion of the top always ends up less done than the rest of it, right? Because basically what you've created here is you've created an air pocket where if it's on the bottom where the thickest portion of it is touching, it's touching the pan where it's good and hot, right? So it's helping cook all the way through. The outsides are in open air. And for some reason, that air pocket inside of there as it bakes isn't as hot as everything else. And for some reason, I've never been able to have a good, consistent bake on it. You guys may have baked them that way and had great luck. I prefer to bake mine right up like this. A little bit of olive oil just to coat them. You can also just use pan spray if you'd like. Sometimes a little bit of salt and pepper, and they're good to go. But you definitely want to bake them to that point where you think they're probably overdone, and then bake them about 5 more minutes, right? And then that will help dry it out a little bit, so that whenever you go to do your flaking, it's not going to turn to mush, okay? If you look at the bottom of them when they're baked, and they almost, you'll be able to tell the difference. They'll be nice and yellow like what this looked like, and if that bottom has a little bit whiter of a consistency to it, coloration to it, it needs to go back in the oven for a little bit longer. That bottom portion just isn't quite done yet. But like I said, you should have nice, even pieces. You should be able to pick it up with your hands, just like regular spaghetti would look.
So, final recipe is butternut squash, apple cranberry bake. This is more of like a dessert type recipe. So the butternut squash, known in Australia and New Zealand, is called the butternut pumpkin, or the grandma, which probably means something that we don't know. But it is a type of winter squash. The flavor profile is sweet, nutty. It tastes similar to a pumpkin. It has a tan yellow, or this is the butternut squash, tan yellow, orangey skin on it. And then, interestingly, all the seeds are in the bottom part. So the seeds in the pulp, none up in this long, skinny part. It's kind of funny looking. So nutrition facts about it, it's very comparable to all the other squashes. It's high in vitamin A. It's a great source of potassium. So just keep in mind if you're trying to get your potassium higher or need some sort of potassium, instead of going for a banana, maybe the squash is the way to go if you enjoy that type of flavor. How you choose a good butternut squash is that it's heavy for its size. That's basically all I read about that. I don't know if the thump works on that. I would keep that with the pumpkin here. So this recipe, I would say taste-wise, is comparable to like a cobbler, except it's less sweet. You don't have that. I feel like whenever I have a cobbler, sometimes that syrup just gives me like it's a too sweet of flavor, and like I just don't want the syrup flavor in it. So this has that best of both worlds, where it tastes not as fake sugary wise, but you get all those good, like the tart from the apple and cranberry, and even like the sweet from the butternut squash. So it's a good marriage of all those flavors. And the one I tried, I didn't add cinnamon at home. This is something that I came back and I was like, this thing needs some cinnamon, because why not? It just would go well with the butternut squash, brown sugar, nutmeg, and why not have some cinnamon in that as well. This recipe is also great because I feel like you can customize it. If you want, you can add some oats to it. You can also add some pecans if you wanted some extra protein with that. It also gives it a great crunchy texture, more texture to it, I feel like, rather than just having all that fruit there. It all ends up being a similar texture, just different sizes of that. So I'll kind of walk you through on how I prepared the butternut squash. So I don't know if you're going to do this, but I'm going for it. So what you need to do for this recipe is cut off both of the ends here. So like this little sliver and then this little sliver. And then I like to skin the long part first, because whenever you skin it, it tends to be slippery. And if you skin the fat part first, your hands are going to slide all over it, trying to skin the skin off of this. So I go for the long part. It's easy to grab, hold up. So the skin is hard, it's tough to get off, so definitely use a good peeler for that. Also, if you want to, you can just cut it right here where the skinny part turns into the hard part, or the fatter part rather, because that's where all the seeds are. And the recipe calls for 1-inch cubes. So then what you want to do is cut this into circles, this long part. So you want to do like 1-inch cuts. And that's how you kind of get your inch cubes. And then once they're circular shape, you can cut those into thirds. And that'll help you get your cubes more uniform shape. I didn't use the fat part just because by the time I got out all the pulp and seeds, it was like super thin. It was like a 1/2 inch thin. You could definitely use that if you want to, but I had plenty of butternut squash left over. And it's more uniform looking if you don't use this part, but you can go right ahead and do that. I won't judge you. So the recipe, when you're baking it, it's definitely going to smell up the house